Welcome to Dark Literature Recap, where I read dark and disturbing books so that you don't have to. Today, I'll be analyzing and discussing the novel Let's Go Play at the Adamses. This book, written by Mendel Johnson, is a horror novel that explores the effects of unrestricted power within a group of kids. This review will be heavy on spoilers, so if you don't want to be spoiled, don't listen past this timestamp. Let's Go Play at the Adamses is a horror novel inspired by the tragic death of Sylvia Likens that also acts as an allegory for American politics. That last point isn't me making wild assumptions either. The copy I had a foreword in the beginning in which the author clearly states that this book is a political metaphor, but we'll get more into that later. The book follows Barbara, a young adult woman who agrees to babysit for a well-off family. One morning, Barbara wakes up to discover that she has been tied to her bed frame by the very children that she's babysitting. The book follows her experiences as we watch what happens when kids have complete power and control, with no authority figure to hold them accountable for their actions. Which brings us to the question: if you haven't read the book, should you stop this video and pick it up? The short answer is probably not. The book isn't terrible, but it's really nothing exceptional. The characters are weak, and the book becomes so obsessed with being a long-form political metaphor that it sacrifices a lot of character development and substance. It isn't a bad book, and you can read it in a weekend, but if you watch this video instead of reading it, you won't miss out on much. Plus, the book is surprisingly difficult to get your hands on, so it might not be worth it depending on where you live. With that out of the way, and without further ado, here's a review of Let's Go Play at the Adamses. Before we start though, a viewer discretion warning. Warning: the following book contains references to, or explicit depictions of, rape, torture, physical abuse, psychological abuse, abuse of children, murder of children, gun violence, kidnapping, and prolonged restraint. Continue at your own discretion. So let's start off with a short summary. Let's Go Play at the Adamses is a pretty short book, at less than 300 pages. And honestly, not much happens, so it's not hard to summarize. Basically, a woman in her 20s named Barbara takes on a babysitting job with a rich family while they're out of town. The two kids she's babysitting, Bobby and Cindy, actually like her and they get along well. She even gets along well with the other kids in the neighborhood that they play with, Diane, John, and Paul, which makes what happens next all the more baffling. Barbara wakes up one morning to discover that she has been tied to her bed frame. We find out later that Bobby, whose father is a doctor with a fully stocked medicine cabinet, chloroformed her the night before. Following this, Bobby and Cindy invite the other kids from the neighborhood to come over and party with them. Now, before I get into what happens next, you need to understand that these are not normal kids by any means. We get little hints throughout the novel that these kids are severely deranged and are not considered to be normal kids even within the context of the novel. They do things like tie up and torture each other, as well as other kids in the neighborhood. It's even hinted at one point that the kids killed or seriously maimed another kid and covered it up. So, with that in mind, things escalate very quickly. The kids only have the house to themselves for a few days before Bobby and Cindy's parents come home, and so the entirety of the novel occurs in only a few days. To start off, they just keep her tied up, but before long, they start to realize that they can do anything that they want with her, and the boys start discussing the possibility of raping her. Now, Bobby has no interest in raping Barbara, but the other two boys quickly force him to be complicit with it and not snitch, threatening to hurt him if he doesn't. The kids establish a new rule. Someone has to be watching Barbara at all times, but while you're on watch duty, you can have complete privacy to do whatever you want with her, and no one else is allowed to ask any questions or refuse. John spends his time on watch of violently raping Barbara, while Paul spends his time torturing her with knives and other tools around the house. This is where the book really starts to lose steam. The beginning is actually really good. It's an absolutely terrifying premise, and the build-up is slow, but it's heartbreakingly obvious what the kids are trying to work themselves up to, especially the older kids. Cindy is 10, so she basically just goes along with what everybody else does. Paul and Bobby are teenagers, or in Bobby's case, close to it. Bobby very quickly stops having fun as the group's actions become darker and darker. Paul, meanwhile, actively embraces the situation and excitedly engages in the torture and brutalization to its fullest. The oldest kids, John and Diane, are interestingly enough the most chilling people in the group. John only cares about raping Barbara, and it's hinted at that he has every intention of raping any woman he can get his hands on after the first time he rapes Barbara. He does so with this cold brutality that is somehow even more disturbing than Paul's excitement. Diane, who's also nearly an adult, enables everything that happens, and it's revealed later in the story that she is a complete sociopath who masterminds most of the events in the novel. All of this should come together to create an incredibly dark and well-written story. The elements are all there, but it doesn't. We'll get into the specifics of why soon, but let's finish up the summary. So Barbara is being raped and tortured for days before the kids finally decide that they need to kill her, otherwise they might get in trouble. Noticing that there are groups of drifters that they call pickers wandering close to the house, Diane concocts a plan to kill Barbara and frame one of the pickers so that they don't get in trouble with their parents. So they drag Barbara out to a decrepit barn on their property, and they torture her to death. Then, they lure over a picker and fatally shoot her. Finally, they stage the scene to make it look like the picker raped and tortured Barbara to death after locking the kids in their closet. And the oldest kid, John, shot and killed him after saving the other kids. And the plan goes off without a hitch. The kids are never brought to justice, and they get off scot-free. So yeah, that's pretty much the whole book. Now, let's get into why this book fails at what it's trying to do. Firstly, let's examine the plot. The novel has a strong start and a really interesting premise. The pieces are all there, and the scenario is both chilling and plausible. While you're reading it, you can really picture a group of kids tying up their babysitter as a prank or to get out of following rules, and things taking a very dark turn as some of the older kids begin developing other ideas. The story even has a pretty solid twist. I can honestly say, I didn't think they were going to kill Barbara. The whole book is framed in a way where, until they come together and agree to kill her, it really feels like they're going to let her go at some point. And the end is pretty brutal and shocking. Overall, I give the plot a 7 out of 10. The book is weak in many areas, but the plot and the setup isn't one. The pacing is solid, and there's plenty of twists to keep you engaged. For writing style, the same can be said about the writing style. It strikes a good balance of having good descriptors without being overly flowery or technical in its language. There's very few metaphors, similes, or figurative language in the book, but the whole thing is kind of one big mess of a political metaphor anyway, so I don't think explicit metaphors would have done it any good. 7 out of 10, not bad. For characters and characterization, this is where things really fell apart. There's no way to sugarcoat it. These characters suck, mainly because they're barely characters. So when I first read this story, I was trying to wrap my brain around why these characters were all so boring and two-dimensional. I thought maybe the writer didn't know how to write kids, but that didn't feel right since the beginning was so strong, and they really do act and talk like kids most of the novel. So for a while, I was stumped. Then, after reading the book, I went back and read the introduction to the book by Grandi Hendrix. And instead of describing it myself, I'll let this quote by Mendel Johnson speak for itself. Barbara, the victimized babysitter, represents the American left, the dreaming left, who is abused and killed. Adults, who have no part in the action of the plot and never know what happened, are the political right. And what's left is the great, silent American majority that supposedly runs things in its odd and unpredictable fashion. So, in essence, the reason these characters feel so flat is because they're not characters. The kids represent Middle America and are designed to be this unknowable entity with bizarre and brutal desires that the average person just can't comprehend. Fine, I can live with this. I would like to know more about these kids and understand why they do what they do. But if we're going to take the H.P. Lovecraft route of avoiding describing difficult or complicated things by just saying, well, you really aren't supposed to understand it, nobody is, then fine, I'll deal. But how the author characterizes Barbara is more frustrating and a lot harder to dismiss. This is the character we're supposed to care about, and we experience most of the book through her, but she has no substance. She barely tries to get out of her situation, and descriptions of her trying to escape are so laughably vague that they might as well not be in the book. The descriptions of a tropical storm will span multiple pages, while descriptions of Barbara trying to escape have maybe a paragraph or two. She's just a victim from start to finish, and she's a victim from start to finish because that's her purpose. She was always designed to be a victim. She discovers too late that she needs to try to escape through any means necessary, which is so mind-bogglingly unrealistic it makes her feel like a caricature. I want a main character who changes and adapts with their circumstances. I want a character who explores the depths of this change and who maybe represents a larger message. But Barbara is just a victim. Her characterization is so bad, even she minimizes the effects of her own rape and torture. Barbara is violently raped, and the only insight we get into how this affects her is that she's anxious about being pregnant, and she goes on this insane, misogynistic exploration on how she has all these conflicting feelings about John because he was her first, and you'll always have feelings for the man who took your virginity, no matter the circumstances. When your novel glosses over and minimizes the emotional effect of your main character getting raped and tortured, you failed at writing a good story. So yeah, what we have here is a story with creepy kids who we gain very little insight on, a main character who is designed to be a helpless victim who simultaneously minimizes every terrible thing that they go through, and no other characters. These characters are terrible. No one grows, no one develops, and no one's personality is properly explored. 3 out of 10. For themes and messages, I don't hate it. I like the idea of writing a novel about power and the dangers of allowing others to have control over you, regardless of how innocent and good-intentioned you believe them to be. It's a tragically timeless, universal message. The execution was lackluster. There was such a focus on maintaining specific roles to keep the political message alive, the rest is kind of sacrificed. He could have had the political left, Barbara, realize that it needs to toughen up and defend itself. It could have had the political left destroyed by Middle America, the kids, and had the political right, the parents, swoop in and fix everything and dole out proper justice. Hell, it could have gone in the opposite direction and had the political left escape the situation through kindness and compassion and work with the political right to find a fair and just punishment. As written, it's a mess, and for that I need to dock it a few points even if it has such a strong thematic base. I give it a 6.67 out of 10. In terms of editing, formatting, and design, I have no complaints. I didn't note any spelling or grammar mistakes, the formatting and layout are consistent throughout, and the cover design for my copy, honestly, I think is absolutely perfect for the book. 10 out of 10, no complaints. For relevance and impact, I acknowledge that this book's themes make it a timeless read, but I believe its potential influence on readers or the literary world as a whole is limited due to this very unrealistic portrayal of power dynamics in the modern day. The political metaphor is just really weak, and the outdated characterization of Barbara specifically, and the general lack of character growth for any of the characters, hold it back from being a classic. But the themes of power and control are solid, and it may or may not have inspired another novel called The Girl Next Door, so it gets bonus points for that. 6 out of 10. For user experience and accessibility, this book is an easy read. I'd say the average person could read this in a weekend and follow along. It's obviously not appropriate for kids, but it's not particularly descriptive in its graphic scenes, so I'd say most people could probably stomach it. That being said, it is not a very easy book to get your hands on. I got lucky and was able to buy a physical copy from Barnes & Noble. But if that's not an option for you, online copies are not easy to find and are actually really expensive for such a short book. In conclusion, I give Let's Go Play at the Addamses a rating of 6.5 out of 10. It's a fine book with a strong start, but it's hindered by weak character development. Personally, if any of this seems interesting to you and you have the means of getting your hands on a copy, go for it. But if you have to pay a bunch of money for one, or if you want a story that has compelling characters, don't bother with this one. Thank you so much for watching. I'm hoping to make this into a 16-part series with a big tier list and a bracket-style competition at the very end. So please leave your extreme horror novel recommendations in the comments down below. In the next video, we'll take a look at a book that also explores an adult being taken hostage by a kid through fear and blackmail, rather than physically. Until then, take care.